Hello there. Today's book is a little controversial, perhaps, because it's talking about it's called God's Messages to the World. You've Got Me All Wrong by Neale Donald Walsh. A friend of mine gave me this book recently in when I was traveling overseas, and I'm not a religious person. I have faith. I'm very spiritual, but I'm really not religious. And so I felt kind of triggered by the use of the word God. But I'm so glad that I persevered and read this book. It has such an interesting perspective. On the back, there's a quick quiz, and it says, "Are these statements true or false? God is to be feared. God may not even exist. God exists and is a superhuman male being. God demands obedience. God sees us as imperfect, and we may not return to God in an imperfect state. God requires us to believe in God and to worship God in a specific way. God is vengeful, and God's love can turn to wrath. Was at war with the devil, and that's how this all began. God determines what's right and wrong. God's forgiveness is required for us to get into heaven. God has a plan for us all. God is on our side. God honors self-sacrifice, long-suffering, preferably in silence, and martyrdom. God sometimes answers our prayers and sometimes does not. God will reward us or punish us on Judgment Day. God wants us to return to heaven. God is separate from us all. Answer key. All of these statements are false." So I'm just going to read one section of this book, but I'm just going to preface it with this little part. It says, "Let's just admit it, we've been wrong before. Could it be that our present assumptions about God are inaccurate and that in some cases even the exact opposite is actually correct? Would that change our view of the world? Has being right all these centuries done much good? Could questioning whether we may have been wrong do much harm? Absent any willingness to put our assumptions to the test, we might as well declare our evolutionary process ended right here. We're not going anywhere. Things are the way they are. That's the way they've always been, and that's the way they will always be. Isn't the world flat? Isn't the earth the center of the universe around which the sun and the stars revolve? If, and only if, the human race had enough of its dysfunctional stick it to the story until the very end behaviours, to say nothing of its vengeful and violent acting out, will it move forward in an examination of the cause of its own conduct? The fact is that beliefs create behaviours, and what we believe is that we have a vengeful and violent God, a jealous God, a God of wrath and retribution. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Really? Well, apparently, yes. The Holy Bible itself recounts the killing of over 2 million people at the hand of the command of God. Can this be true, or could the Bible be wrong about this? That matter, could the Bible be wrong about anything? Could the Quran? And what of the Bhagavad Gita? What of the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud? Might there be an error in the Rig Veda, the Brahmanas, the Upanishads? Are there mistaken notions in the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Puranas? Oh my goodness me, sorry about this pronunciation. What about the Tao Te Ching, the Buddha Dharma, the Dhammapada, the Shihichi, or the Pali Canon? Sorry. Are we to believe every single word of the Book of Mormon? Not all of these sources speak of a violent God, but all speak of larger truths, and millions have been touched by what they've had to say. The point? We have believed variously in the words of these holy scriptures, and to ask a fair question again, where has it gotten us? Is it time to question the prior assumption? Perhaps so. No, not perhaps, absolutely. But why? What if we're wrong about God? What difference would it make? Would it matter if, in any practical way in our day to day lives, could it really have an effect on the entire planet? Of course it could and would. And every thinking person must ask first, how is it that God had communicated God's truth directly to human beings, as so many religions assert? The messages those human beings have shared are not identical. Why all the differences, some subtle and some very significant? What is becoming more and more clear is that while God was sending those communications, it was humans that were receiving them, and it was other humans who were interpreting what they received. To put this succinctly, while the original message has not been clear, not or while the original message has been clear, not all the messengers have been, especially those who've received the message from those who've received the message. In other words, the interpreters of what the first messengers heard and shared. This is not the interpreter's fault. It simply reflects the ability of all of those within a species to whom the message is sent to fully understand it when it is first presented. This, in turn, would have them to do when, during the course of a species' evolution, the message was initially received. In humanity's case, this was thousands of years ago, and since then our species has evolved considerably, and so we have expanded in our ability to understand the original message was telling us. So let's just admit it. The very first interpretations of the very first message may not have been totally, absolutely, and completely accurate. And that is the point here. The assertion is not that religion per se has gotten it all wrong. The contention is that the information may simply be incomplete and thus not completely accurate. Can we just admit that? We are starting to. It has taken a long time, but we're starting to. So I'm just going to jump to a chapter which discusses one of the questions on the back page. So the question is, another misunderstanding about God. God demands obedience. Let us explore how the personal character of this pure energy called God, this essential essence that can form itself into any shape and take on any personality, this source of its supreme intelligence and absolute power. As we've noted, the vast majority of the world's people believe that God exists. The question is, what kind of a God is this? Much of the world believes in a God who is a male super being who demands obedience. We also note that the vast majority of those who believe in God believe that God is judging, condemning, punishing when God demands are not met. Now comes the great what if. What if God demands nothing, judges nothing, and punishes nothing? Would it make a difference? Does it matter? In the overall scheme of things, would it have any significant impact in our planetary experience? Yes. More violence, more brutality, more killing, and more outright war has been committed in the name of God than in any other banner. If the entire world believes that God demands nothing, judges nothing, and punishes nothing, the spiritual basis for much of the righteousness that underlies, justifies, and motivates humanity's most egregious and self-damaging behavior would evaporate. Further, if judgment and punishment were now said to be not part of God's kingdom, the foundation of humanity's entire legal system would be shaken to the core, with many of the laws in many of our countries having to be rewritten or repealed. As well, if we embrace the notion that God demands and commands nothing, many of our cultural norms, customs, and prohibitions would be stripped of their moral authority and would likewise eventually have to be abandoned for lack of any premise or basis. Nowhere is this better illustrated than in the case of same-gender marriage. Even its restrictions against marriages outside of a person's faith or race were held as being against God's law, but are now seen as perfectly acceptable expressions of love, except in some Muslim sects and other ultra-fundamentalist religious communities. So too will gay marriage one day become widely embraced as an entirely appropriate between people who deeply love each other. This will occur when the entirety of humanity abandons all notions that the expression of true love that strays from the past societal norms somehow breaks God's commandments. If there were no commandments from God, then we can no longer kill, no longer punish, no longer judge, oppress, harm, restrict, limit, or damage others in the name of the Lord. This would wipe out an entire mountain of vindication for a huge catalogue of human cruelties and atrocities. The question is, would it also remove humanity's experience, a moral compass upon which our species has depended? What would our new moral compass be? God's message to the world. God has been telling us from the very beginning, and it's become more clear to us every day, that humanity's ancient cultural story about a God who is demanding and commanding is plainly and simply inaccurate. It is okay now to remove this ancient teaching from our current story and to stop telling this to ourselves and our children. God demands and commands nothing. And this is because God has no reason to demand or command anything. And this is because God needs nothing. God needs no experience, emotional, physical, or spiritual. Since God is the source of every experience, God could have it. How can the source of something need that thing? How can the source of everything need anything? And if the source of everything needs nothing, why would it command anything? It's not as if some behavior of ours, such as obeying God, could cause God to have the experience that God could not have without us exhibiting that behavior. To put this another way, God is not dependent upon us for God's non-existent needs to be met. There is no reason then to believe in a God that is so displeased in the absence of a particular behavior that we will be punished horribly or eternally. God is love, and this love knows neither condition nor limitation. It is not based on receiving anything back, and is not withheld because God is angry to the point of everlasting condemnation, for the simple reason that God is never angry to the point of everlasting condemnation, or even angry at all. There are those who say God demands and commands things, not because God needs something, but because we need something. Specifically, we need instructions, directions, requirements, and commandments in order to stop ourselves from running amok and to help us make our lives work. This viewpoint holds that without commandments and directions, we wouldn't know how to behave, or be willing to or able to behave in ways that serve our continued survival because of our very nature. It is said by some that it is human nature to behave irresponsibly and uncontrollably, selfishly and even violently, and that it is only God's requirement and restrictions and the threat of God's punishment if we don't heed them that keeps us from being totally self-centered, self-serving, and self-destructive. Following suit, punishment has come from the rationale of all civil laws and government regulations restricting and governing the behavior of people, from stoplights and speed limits that must be obeyed, to product labeling rules that must be followed, to sanitary conditions that must be maintained, to workplace regulations that must be followed. Without these and other behavioral rules being imposed, the conventional wisdom goes everybody would do as they pleased, no one would be protected, and people everywhere would be victim of those who are careless and unscrupulous. Yet, are humans incapable of being self-regulating? The answer is no. All humans have the innate ability to govern their own behaviors and to adjust them to the degree that they harm no one, while producing maximum positive results for each individual and maximum benefit for the collective. All we have to do is determine to use that innate ability. Ironically, what ignites the desire to do so is the absence of rules and regulations from God or anyone else. God understands this. That is why the ultimate gift God has given humanity is free will. Freedom is the fundamental nature of divinity, and God knows that humanity will always act in humanity's best interests, once those best interests made clear. If you want a wonderful example of this, watch the people as they whiz around the traffic circle at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, where there are no lane markings, no traffic lights, no signs showing who goes first or where, and no police officer to direct the endless and rapid flow of vehicles. Thousands of people make their way around the monument every day in a hectic mishmash of interweaving iron on tires, and they do not have to be forced by any law or regulation to yield the right of way, stop before smashing into others, or go where others have stopped. They do so automatically. When you know what it is you're trying to do, the preferable and beneficial action to take becomes instantly obvious and very clear to you. And that's why there are fewer traffic accidents on the circle than there are on the Champs-Élysées, 100 yards away, where traffic lights abound, lanes clearly marked, and the way to proceed is guided by rules and regulations. Humanity on the global scale cannot become clear about its own best interests until humanity on a global scale is clear about what it's trying to do. And this is where we've fallen short. We have not moved to total clarity and mutual agreement on what it is we're up to during the time on our earth. Once we do, our behaviors will self-modify and self-regulate in ways that will produce maximum effectiveness. A species that is highly evolved is one that has reached a collective understanding about what is in its highest and best interest, based on a mutually held awareness of what is seeking to achieve and to experience. Because we're not at that stage in development and evolution of humanity, the pressing question today becomes, what could get us there? The answer is a letting go of our ancient cultural story about who we are and why we're alive, about the purpose and process of life, about the nature and desire of God. God told us in the new revelations that in order to get to that place, we will need to have the courage to take 5 huge steps. Step 1. Acknowledge that some of our old beliefs about God and about life are no longer working. Step 2. Acknowledge that there is something we do not understand about God and life, the understanding of which will change everything. Step 3. Be willing for a new understanding of God and life to now be brought forth, an understanding that could produce a new way of life on this planet. Step 4. Be courageous enough to explore and examine this new understanding, and if it aligns with our inner truth and knowing, to enlarge our belief system to include it. Step 5. Choose to live our lives as a demonstration of our highest and grandest beliefs, rather as a denial of them. A huge shift in humanity's thinking, perhaps the biggest invitation has ever issued by life to life, would be the accepting, embracing, and adopting and the following spiritually revolutionary statement. Nothing can occur in all of the universe that violates the will of God. Everything in human theology, virtually every tenet of every religion on the face of the earth, is rooted and built on the exact opposite thought. God's will can be violated, our religions say, and this is the foundation of every religious doctrine and judgment, condemnation and punishment. Yet the violation of God's will is utterly impossible unless there is something more powerful than God in the universe and something that will override God's will. But nothing of the sort exists, for God is the all in all, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end, the sum total of everything. If therefore something is happening, it is happening because God has not stopped it from happening. And if God has not stopped it from happening, how can it be said that it's happening against God's will? Those who say that God allows God's will to be thwarted and therefore it is possible for people to violate the will of God have rendered themselves blind to the simple logic. If God allows something, then it is not against God's will. You could not lift your finger if God did not want you to. Everything that happens therefore happens because God allows it, or it wouldn't and couldn't be happening. The theological question thus becomes not whether God allows and therefore wills what is happening to be happening, but why God would allow it. The answer is that God's greatest desire is for the fundamental aspect of divinity that we spoke of, freedom, to be expressed in every moment by every manifestation of divinity. And since God cannot be hurt or damaged in any way by anything at all, God has no reason to place restrictions on the freedom of any of God's creations or creatures. God also has no reason to judge, condemn, and punish anyone who uses that freedom. Indeed, to do so would change the definition of freedom itself, so that it would mean the ability to do as you're told or suffer the consequences. Yet this is not what freedom means. That is not freedom at all. Freedom is love demonstrated. It is love in action. Restriction of any kind is not love in action, because restriction is limitation, and love knows no such thing. Total love and absolute freedom are synonymous and produce the theological concept known as free will. God has given all of God's creatures this gift so that God could give itself the gift of totally experience the wonder and glory of what it is. Yet free will is obviously not free will if the use of it in a particular way produces indescribable and everlasting torture in the fires of hell. Such a response to the use of God's greatest gift to humanity would make a mockery of both the gift and the giver. As well, free will means nothing in the environment in which there are no choices. If God is to experience its full wonder and glory, that which is not considered fully wondrous or glorious in human terms must exist alongside of that which is, so to produce context within which wonder and glory itself may not be simply shown, but expressed and experienced. Thus, the physical universe has been created as a contextual field within the choices become possible. Another way of saying this is that the contextual field, that is our universe, exists in the way that it does, because the absence of that which is not, that which is not. That is, it cannot be experienced. In the absence of darkness, light cannot be experienced. In the absence of small, big cannot be experienced. In the absence of there, here cannot be experienced. In the absence of slow, fast cannot be experienced. Nothing can be experienced in the absence of a contrasting element. It can be known theoretically, but it cannot be expressed experientially. Therefore, God has created a universe in which divinity has what appear to be exact opposites or dualities, but is not. Using an example from our physical reality, we often label things as hot or cold. These appear to be the opposite ends of the polarity, but they are not. They are degrees of the same thing, or temperature. There is no duality in temperature. There is only one thing, variously expressed. In much the same way, all manifestations of life expressions demonstrating degrees or variations or single things called divinity. And thus has God invited divine human individuations to judge themselves, and to judge not, and neither condemn that which seems to oppose them, but to see it as simply as another aspect of self, providing an opportunity to be light unto the darkness, that they might know who they really are, and that all those whose lives they touch might know who they really are as well, by the light of this example. One's free will choosing of any thought, word, or deed need not be, therefore, a demonstration of one's obedience, but may be an acceptance of one's invitation from God to step into the highest demonstration of one's best idea about oneself. With this understanding, what may have been considered one's burden may become one's joy. Life becomes an experience of exaltation when one realizes, finally and at last, that neither fear nor obedience are required by God. You can see that Neale Donald Walsh really takes into consideration and challenges our ways of thinking, our ways of being. It's a tricky book to read, but I think it's one well worth it. Let me know what you think. Did you like this? Have you got any thoughts? Let me know below.